course, there's no way to celebrate 20 years of advocacy without taking some time to look back. And so this panel, entitled Yesterday, How Advocates Help Change the Conversation of Medical Cannabis, we have brought together a group of medical cannabis advocates that have been working with Americans for Safe Access for a lot of that 20 years. So we're going to hear from Duncan, who is now a cannabis consultant, but he was also a co-founder of Americans for Safe Access, and he's still on the board. He has over 22 years of experience in cannabis management and operations, working with state and local licensing, legislative advocacy, and working on community relations and business consulting. He was actually one of the early champions of local regulations and licensing, and actually helped pass legislation in California to create the licensing program. And Don worked for years as a California director for Americans for Safe Access, and he helped expand patients' rights by passing legislation that protected employment rights, parental rights, and he also passed a very important piece of legislation that protects organ transplant patients. So we're super excited to have him. We have Tony Bowles, who is a cannabis advisor and a longtime patient advocate. He's a member, of course, of Americans for Safe Access, and he's also the chair of the Bay Area chapter. Tony has worked on legislative efforts at the local, state, and federal level, and he has over 20 years experience working in this field. We're also going to hear from Caren Woodson, who is now the Director of Compliance and Licensing at Kiva Confections, but she is a nationally recognized medical cannabis expert, and we were lucky to have some of her time in the early days of Americans for Safe Access, when she served as our first government affairs director. She now serves as a board member for the California Cannabis Manufacturing Association and is the California Cannabis Industry Association board secretary. We also have Paul Scott, who is the president of LA Black Pride. He was a nurse for many years and worked with AIDS patients. And he was also on the board of one of the first cannabis dispensaries, the Oakland Cannabis Buyers Cooperative. And when it was shut down, he actually went to Inglewood and opened a medical cannabis dispensary, which he was running when I met him. And he actually kept that dispensary open for 12 years. And then for the Q&A, Rebecca Saltzman is going to join us. She is currently the president of the BART board in the Bay Area, but she was also our former chief of staff. She has over 2 decades of experience working with nonprofits, and we were lucky enough to have her begin her career with us at Americans for Safe Access, where she started off as a volunteer, and then during that 5 years actually worked her way up to chief of staff, and she helped us operate both a California and DC office. And Rebecca is now the development director for the Bike East Bay, and she's an elected member of the BART board, and she's currently the board president. So a great group to help us go back in memory lane. Some of those memories are good. A lot of them were scary. And now we're going to hear from Duncan, who is actually the co-founder of Americans for Safe Access and has been an ally to patients for over 25 years. And Don is going to tell us about his experience in starting ASA and the world that brought us to the current marketplace we have today. Don?
Thank you, Steph. Great to be here today. And it's so exciting that this is the 20-year anniversary of this organization. That's awesome. And looking back, I can't believe where the time has gone. And so here we are 20 years later. And when I look back on ASA and on medical cannabis in California, nationwide, what a long, strange trip this has been. You know, we started this out, actually, let me rephrase that. We did not start this out. We were standing on the shoulders of those who came before us. And so many people took so much action and sacrificed so much and took so many risks so that we could come to the point where we were in the 1990s, where we looked at the situation and said, we have to get involved. And I remember in 1996, we passed Proposition 215 in California, and we thought we were done. I'm like, there we go. Medical marijuana is finished. And I went on to other things. I was doing the peace movement and protecting the ancient redwoods in California. And I thought we were done. And then they came back. They came back to California and they started raiding medical marijuana dispensaries. And my friends and I said, if they're going to come in here and do this, if they're going to shut down these dispensaries, we're going to open one dispensary every time they shut one down, so they can never make progress. And we did not succeed in that goal because they came back and they shut down a lot of dispensaries. But I opened my first dispensary in the year 1999, actually. And so it was a long time ago. And we realized right away that just selling medical cannabis to patients or giving it away for free, as was often the case, was not enough, that there had to be some kind of change that happened. And so Berkeley Patients Group, my first dispensary, set out and we became what I believe is the first locally licensed medical cannabis dispensary in the state of California. The city of Berkeley gave us a business license. I don't think they knew what they were doing, but we still knew that we weren't safe. We had to change state law. We had to change the system, not just the retail environment. And so we set about to do that. We set about to change the system. And a friend of mine said, hey, you need a coordinator. You need someone to run this thing. You need a campaign. Now, I'll be honest, I didn't know what a campaign was, but we hired this crazy woman from San Diego, and we told her, look, answer the phones, check the mail, host 2 events a year, and we're good. And she sized us up right away and said, no, you're not good. You're all going to go to jail. And so Steph Scher came in and created Americans for Safe Access. And we started our first real campaign. And it was remarkable. And it was there was a place for this in the world. It was time for something like this, where we said, no, we're not just going to fight back. We're not going to protest. We're going to change things. We're going to do something in this system, and we're going to make a difference. And it was a whole sea change in the world of medical marijuana at that point, because in those days we said marijuana and not cannabis. And so we set about to create this campaign. And so me and Steph and many other important people who were dedicated to this cause set about to create an organization and a movement that could actually make medical cannabis for real. And it's really important to remember that in those early days, we were a candle in the wind. They could have snuffed us out at any moment. But we persevered, and we didn't manage to go 1-to-1 with shutdown clubs. We went 10-to-1. Like at some point, dispensaries just proliferated and spread around the state. And it was a testament to the tenacity and the spirit of, I think, of defiance of these early activists and advocates who said, no, you can't shut us down. We voted for this, and we're going to have it in our state. And so we set about to activate the base, the grassroots, the patients who are missing. And in those early days in the 1990s, there wasn't a patient voice at the table so much. It was lobbyists, lawyers, academics. They were all talking about medical cannabis, but they weren't living medical cannabis. And so what ASA brought, and what I'm so proud of, is that ASA brought the patients to the table to say, this is what we need. We need this. We need access. We need dignity. We need civil rights. And that was a huge sea change in this movement for medical cannabis. It wasn't at that point about legalizing pot because I have a, quote, right to get high. It's about legalizing cannabis for medical use because I need this, because it's right for me. And so that was really the origin. And I think it's unfortunate today in the 21st century that we've forgotten that medical cannabis started with cancer and HIV and AIDS, and it came from the streets. And I remember those old days before Proposition 215 passed in California, of marching in the streets with giants like Dennis Perone, who really created all of this for us. Brownie Mary was there, Mary Rathburn, like they were there, and we marched and we held signs and we chanted, and we didn't know if we were making a difference or not, but it turned out that early effort changed the world. And then other states came along, and LA came along, and it slowly unfolded, and we didn't know we were making that difference in the early days, but we were. And it's very rewarding to look back and see it. But I also remember those bad old days when we were afraid every day that we were going to get busted, basically. I remember sleeping with my cell phone plugged in by my bed because I couldn't be away from my phone for even a minute. There was a crazy incident one night where some guy was delivering pizza, but he came to the wrong address. And I heard him coming up the steps to my house. And I stood with my back against the wall next to the door because I thought they were going to kick it in and bust me right then. But it was just a wrong address. And we were paranoid, we were crazy. And a lot of people said, oh, this is the good life, but it wasn't. We were afraid every single day that we would get busted. And it wasn't unjustified. I did finally get busted by the DEA. I went down to LA in 2004 because I realized if medical cannabis was just a Bay Area phenomena, if this is just something those crazy hippies in San Francisco do, then it's not for real, because most of the political power, most of the votes, most of the money in the state of California comes from Los Angeles County. And so I realized we have to go down there. We have to be missionaries for medical cannabis in Los Angeles County. And so I went down in 2004 and I opened a shop, and I started to be a missionary for medical cannabis. I started helping other people to open. I started showing them how to do it, how to do it right, how to be safe, how to be ethical. And a tidal wave of safe access flowed over LA County and the city. And it was really shocking to see. And, I was even myself surprised to see what happened in Los Angeles County, because we didn't know this could ever happen in LA. And people said, oh, well, sure, LA, but not Orange County, not San Diego. Well, there are dispensaries all over Orange County and San Diego. They're in Riverside County. They're in Imperial County. We've really seen a sea change in California in terms of access to cannabis. And that culminated with the adoption of Proposition 64. But it wasn't, and by the way, that's not the end of the story. That was just a high watermark for patients and for adult use consumers. But it wasn't without a cost. And in the year 2007, the DEA came to my door. It was funny, I told 60 Minutes, Muriel Schaefer and I were sitting down, and I said they could kick in that door at any minute. And they did. They kicked in the door, and they raided my shop. They held my staff at gunpoint with machine guns. They smashed all our display counters, even though there were doors on the back. They could have opened them. And it was a horrifying experience, and devastating for the staff and for the patients. And we were lucky because nobody got prosecuted. But right now, today, there are people in prison for doing what I did every day as a medical cannabis operator. And we have unfinished business. People think, oh, well, it's legal in California. It's legal in all these states. It's okay. We're done. But we're not done. We're not done with this work because people are in jail. People are being discriminated against when it comes to access to healthcare, when it comes to parental rights, housing rights, employment rights. We have a lot of work left to do to make sure that the promise of Proposition 215 is fulfilled and the patients are okay. And I welcome our adult use brothers and sisters to that fight. We need them here, but we always have to remember those early days in San Francisco, marching through the streets for cancer and for AIDS and for the other sick people. That's where we started, and that's where this campaign will one day end. So that's why I'm still working on the fight for safe access.
Thanks, Don. Yeah, that was definitely a crazy time. And I'm going to be talking on the next panel. I'm actually going to be doing sort of a summation of some of the campaigns, sort of back up what you were just talking about. But when you were talking about the sort of the missionary work that you did going down to Los Angeles, I think you're being a little modest in that today there are all of these consultants and people that are making lots of money, helping people with their applications and helping them, train their staff and all these components. And what Duncan did was literally every person who called him, called ASA, that said that they wanted to open the dispensary. He said, when can you meet? And he handed over all of the paperwork they needed for staff handbooks. He showed them how to track inventory. At that time, we had to be very careful about all of the providers had to be very careful about what they wrote down, because that was evidence in court of how much you were breaking the federal law. But also, for when you were talking about us first meeting, my political background, I'd worked on a lot of social change movements, but when I realized what you guys were doing, I was like, you guys are really openly committing federal civil disobedience every day. And the civil disobedience I had done, I've been arrested several times, but it was literally for incommoding or possession of lumber, or doing acrobatics in the city limits without a net, I think was one of my charges. But basically I was facing some fines and maybe a night in jail. And what I also knew about the war on drugs is that 98% of people who are charged with a drug crime, they plead guilty. And so no one ever gets to actually see the injustices of the drug war. And by coming up and saying, no, these laws are wrong, we are breaking them, arrest us if you want to, you guys changed the world. And you created a way that that the world could see what our drug laws were doing, and that they were unjust and they should be changed. And so it was an honor to organize a movement around the country that every time there was a raid, we were in the streets. It was an honor to tell your story to the world. I'm tearing up a little bit, but yeah, I think, I was one of those people that slept with a cell phone next to her head until we passed the CJS amendment. But thank you for everything that you've done, Dawn. I think someone told me once that ASA was going to be the most important asterisk in the history of medical cannabis, but I think you deserve a little bit more space than that. So thank you so much. And as we were building this movement in California, we were, at one hand, we saw an opportunity to utilize this sort of intense raids with DEA coming to the doors. We could really show people at home, in their home, a visual of DEA coming in and taking patients' medicine. We had patients outside with signs that said DEA go away. But we also knew we needed more support than just cities and counties. And we needed more support than just local activists. And so part of our strategic plan was changing federal law. And, anyone who's worked with me will tell you I'm intense about my strategic planning. But we really looked under every rock to see what it was going to take to change federal law. And one of the, as I was, trying to figure out who was going to be, with us, in this fight, I met Caren Woodson, who was an ally to us in DC, and when we opened our office in DC, later come to work with us. And now we'll hear from Caren Woodson.
Great, thanks, Steph, and welcome to the panelists, but also to members and those of us joining us online. 20 years is quite an accomplishment. I echo Dawn's sentiment there. For some of us, medical marijuana is a passion. For other of us, it's a life sentence. That is certainly my story. But I think it's important to look back after 20 years and sort of acknowledge where you've been so that you can understand where you might want to go. And in that case, to that, I extend absolute congratulations and heartfelt excitement about the progress that continues to happen. We now have medical marijuana research legislation passed, which is amazing, something that ASA was on the forefront of fighting for 20 years ago when they were created. And we now have some significant action towards rescheduling, which is another issue that ASA championed in the early days. So I'm excited to join this panel and bring some context to the history of medical marijuana and especially on the policy side. So my story in this in ASA sort of merged because I was at the time working for the Drug Policy Alliance in Washington, D.C. When I say that marijuana is a life sentence, I'm not kidding. I've been doing this work since I was about 18 years old. And my foray entered into the criminal justice aspect and really understanding that for the vast majority of youth, coming off the heels of the 96 crime legislation, that the vast majority of youth were brought into the criminal justice system through the use or possession of marijuana. And so my foray into the Drug Policy Alliance was really at my heart the goal to change that and to legalize or change a policy that was, one, inherently racial, but two, just didn't make sense in terms of being free in America, and for me mirrored and continues to mirror, frankly, what we saw during the 13 years of alcohol prohibition. So for a policy expert, this is an interesting was going to be an interesting trajectory to follow. And so I'm sitting at the office in Washington, D.C., and I'm working on some, pretty heady, reviews of drug policy legislation. And I get this phone call out of the blue from a woman who introduced herself as Steph Shear, and said basically that the Drug Policy Alliance was responsible for helping pass Prop 215 in California. And did we know that there were access points that were now being raided by the federal government, and sort of demanded what we were going to do about that. And it was sort of a shocking phone call. This was sort of, really in the war on drugs, a new battle that was raging, and we were at the precipice of that. And so immediately took this to my boss and was like, hey, you should talk to this woman. There's something going on in California. We should get behind that. And the sentiment at the time was, yikes, raids, they're not supposed to be opening. I don't think that was the intention. It was really about just, making sure that people weren't going to be, arrested for use. And I suggested, what, it's an issue. This isn't going to go away if this happens and continues to happen, regardless of whether or not we want to deal with it, we will have to deal with it. And so, I, suggested they take the call. I kid you not, within 3 weeks, there was a meeting, a coalesced meeting between most of the larger drug policy orgs at the time, who did meet occasionally, but I wouldn't say worked in coalition well together. But lo and behold, 3 weeks after this phone call, we were all sitting in a large room together, and this very tenacious and very direct campaigner essentially approached us and was like, look, we're going to do a 50 city, direct action where we're going to, go and staple cease and desist orders at the DEA, offices around the nation. And, this was going to be an opportunity to really, bring this issue to the forefront, get on the front page of some newspapers and make some hay out of a situation. And I think, I think we were like, okay, that's interesting. And she wasn't asking for a whole lot of money. So for people who work in Washington, D.C. and were spending money left and right, it was an interesting concept to like, hey, maybe there is something here. So eventually, we did this 50 city action, and it was the first time that medical marijuana not only hit the front page, but was above the fold in a lot of cases. And that was a sea change in terms of a perspective from patients that was going on. And so when I came into the mold at ASA and eventually came on board, my goal was to translate the California patient experience into a Washington, D.C. oriented policy. And we didn't do that alone. There were lots of groups working on this issue, but I think what ASA brought to the table was a perspective, as Steph mentioned, that nobody else was providing, and that was literally the voice of patients, in addition to the voice of individuals who were putting their literal lives on the line to provide those patients with safe access and, what I think is a point of dignity, in terms of having a safe and legal place to access this important product. And so it was very quickly. I came out to California. I literally moved from DC to California. It was very important for Steph to have for the political ops to have a California-based experience and understand what was going on here. So in the 2 years that I spent in California, I really took the opportunity to write some of the laws that we currently still have in place: the Berkeley law, the Oakland law, the San Francisco law, West Hollywood law, and started to make the right. If all politics is local, I felt like we really had to cement the local support so that we could translate that to the national experience. And so by doing that work and engaging that work, it was really easy then to go back to Washington, D.C., set up a shop, and then communicate this entire picture. That culminated, as Steph said, when all these raids were continuing to happen. We essentially set up a communication system that anytime a raid was happening, the entire California delegation and the justice committees in Congress were getting emails basically saying in real time, this activity is occurring at this location by the Drug Enforcement Agency. This person has a license. They've been operating for, safely for X number of years with community support. And this is how much it's costing. And when they started to see that pattern and that cadence consistently, with no impact to the number of facilities that were continuing to open, I think for Congress, it became clear that, to Steph's point, civil act of disobedience can translate very quickly into policy reform. And so it was through that mechanism and through the support and continuous communications with DC about what was happening in California and then in other jurisdictions, that we were able to build the allyship necessary to get us to the CJS amendment and eventually to the detente granted by the Cole and Ogden memos in late 2008. So it's been a long story, but it started with a tenacious and very scrappy group of dedicated professionals. And I'm so pleased that a lot of those people remain in the industry or the movement today.
Thank you, Caren. I'm teared up, and what I want people to know is that I remember making those phone calls and really having them fall on deaf ears. But Caren became, she's being a little modest here about how I was able to pull that meeting together of people in DC. Caren had to advocate for Americans for Safe Access constantly, and that fight is really what made me pursue her to come and be our government affairs director. But Caren also, and this is something that she probably wouldn't talk about herself, but when we opened the DC office, we were the only woman-ran organization in this space, and people were not kind to Caren. And they used to call us the bitches of ASA in a lot of the corners, and that translated into not only people trying to meet around us and not inviting us to meetings, but it also included a lot of people calling my funders and telling them not to fund me, saying that just because instead of saying we were passionate, saying we were bitchy, which is often happens to women. But Caren really
held her own. But she also, when we did the first strategic plan at Americans for Safe Access in 2002, and looked at everything it was going to take to pass federal legislation, that list was long. That list included, we were hearing from policymakers that they couldn't change federal law because we would be breaking the UN single treaty. So Americans for Safe Access started working on rescheduling cannabis at the UN level, which we did in 2020. That was a long battle. They told us that cannabis is a gateway drug and causes psychosis. And through utilizing the Data Quality Act, we were able to challenge that information with the DEA, and they had to remove it. And the DEA no longer can talk about gateway theory or about cannabis creating psychosis. But we also, knew that we couldn't just be a bunch of activists by ourselves and a bunch of people breaking the law. We really needed to solidify in law what we were doing, because Proposition 215, while it was an amazing start, it really just created criminal exceptions for people once they were already arrested. And it didn't talk about access and about where patients could get medical cannabis. And so that was something that was, we were doing, but we needed to solidify that. And so I remember talking to Dawn in the early days about, I was like, I think you guys have to tell people what you're doing here, because if you don't, you're just a bunch of people selling weed out of a building. And, some of that, Jeff, can you unmute Caren? I don't want them muted while I'm talking. I want it to be more dialogue. And so when we looked around to try to find greater support, and I talked, to Caren with her policy background, I was like, we need to pass local legislation. And she's like, okay, well, what should that look like? And so I remember sitting down with Dawn and the other dispensary operators, and they were very nervous about regulations. And I said, well, you guys, there are regulations. And they're like, what do you mean? I was like, well, can anybody go into a dispensary? And they're like, no, they have to be a patient. I was like, how do you know they're a patient? I said, well, they have to bring a doctor's recommendation. And then we have to call that doctor and make sure that it's real, right? And so all of these things that they were doing were actually regulations and translated into law. And it was through Caren's help, teaching us how to do that we were able to, start in the Bay Area, spread that to the state level, and spread that across the country. And at this time, where we weren't able to get movement at the city level or the state level, we also utilized the courts a lot. And we sued every agency, I think, Don, in California.
A lot of them.
Which we'll hear from Tony Bowles later about his help in us going after the California Highway Patrol, and we of course we had to sue DMV and everyone. But what was really moving to me was just how compassionate Caren was. Kind of coming from a DC world, and yes, it was a little crazy coming from DC into California. And realizing that the work of our patient advocacy wasn't just making signs and having patients show up. What we also realized is just because you're a medical cannabis patient doesn't mean that you have a policy degree. And so we also had to really sit down with our members and patients and teach them how to make policy, much more in depth than that little cartoon of how a bill becomes a law, but really explain that politicians are not our enemies, that actually cannabis is illegal because people aren't asking the right questions, right? They're not just saying this is a conspiracy, right? It's not just a conspiracy. No one was talking to their elected officials about medical cannabis. And that's what scares me today, right? If you have not talked to your member of Congress this year about medical cannabis, who's talking to them? I'll tell you who's talking to them: drug testing companies and Kevin Sabat. So if you want your member of Congress to have another point of view, it's up to you. And Caren really brought, helped us, educate our membership on that, and helped us translate our dreams into policy. And Caren, you've forever changed medical cannabis. So I'm probably gonna be crying this whole conference, so I'm gonna apologize in advance, but
It's a touching moment. It's a touching time. I mean, 20 years deserves some celebration, and it's always going to be emotional. At 3 points, like, look, in the early days, I took those fights, those insidious sort of, conflicts in the early days as a sign that when you're doing right, they're going to come for you. Like, they're going to target you when you're doing the right thing. And we knew we were doing the right thing. And it was a message that only this group could carry, which I think, was a touch point. But we're still around. We are still here.
Stuff, like, I can imagine how this becomes emotional.
Yeah.
Because in trying to send you my bio, I had to research some stuff that I had completely forgotten about. I had forgotten about when my house got raided and LAPD really came about, really came up on stuff, and I got charged, and I had forgotten about a lot of that stuff, Steph. So really, like, some stuff you better off let it forget, but it was a journey. It was a real tough journey. And I'm grateful that you're pulling this conference together. Then let's just recognize that, if nothing else, pat ourselves on the back for getting us this far.
absolutely. And this is a great transition to hear from one of my favorite people in medical cannabis, and was one of the most inspiring people I met when we were first pulling medical cannabis together. And Don had mentioned, most of the activity around medical cannabis was happening in the Bay Area, where there was at the very least, a community tolerance for access to medical cannabis. And I kept hearing about this cannabis dispensary in Inglewood, California. I was like, what do you guys mean? I was like, who's talking to him? You're like, who are these guys? And so I got in my car and went down. I called Paul up and I said, I want to meet you. I'm coming down. And so, for someone who really started, really changed a lot of people's minds and hearts, and really took this to a community that was underserved and underrepresented. Paul was a beacon of hope, not just for medical cannabis, but for me personally. To have someone so courageous be there in Inglewood, serving such an underrepresented community for so many reasons. So with that, Paul, welcome, and we'd love to hear your story.
Well, Steph, I appreciate you, and I appreciate what you're doing. I know a lot of you all are probably wondering what this Black man doing in this space. But the universe does what the universe does. And I remember going to I used to sell elevators, and I was in San Francisco. And I heard there's a rumor that there was a medical marijuana club open. It was Dennis Peron's club on Market Street. And it was the first club ever open. And I went in that place, and they had like 3 stories of different cannabis, and they had a band playing. And I went in that space, and some nurse asked me why I was using it for medical, and they let me go up, and I got my weed and I got the fuck out of there, because I realized that your motherfuckers are crazy. Y'all are going to jail. This shit can't happen. Let me get my weed and get the hell out of here. And that's how I felt about that place. I'd never seen anything like it. And sure enough, shortly thereafter, it was shut down. But again, it was rumored that there was going to be another club opening over in Oakland. And so I go over there, and Jeffrey's just beginning that club, just beginning to start that up. And I, in my suit and tie, and he asked me if I would want to be on his board. And I said, sure, why not? And from there, I guess the rest is history. I remember when that club first opened up, as a board member, I could just go in, I could go behind the counters, the staff respected me. And so as a board member for Jeffrey, I saw how he shuffled that through the city council, how he had to have Nate Miley, a Black man, to declare a state of emergency in Oakland so they didn't come and shut it down. So I was part of all that process. And a picture that stuck in my mind was when I would come across the bridge, and I was just see a long line of these dejected Black folks. For the first time, they had access to pot legally. I remember going across there, I would see Black folks coming up for drugs, coming down from crack, in wheelchairs, just dejected, sick Black folk. And I just was stunned by that picture. There was a line around the corner. And I was part of and helped Jeffrey navigate this through city council. And so when Oakland became the first, I saw how that was done. It was done basically in a black city with a black city councilman. And so when things happened in my life that forced me medically to quit my 9-to-5 job, my professional job, and I got sick, and I thought, let me find a black city in Los Angeles just like Oakland. That'll let me get away with this. And so I knew I just couldn't come to LA because LAPD would have locked my ass up. I knew that. So I had to go to Inglewood. Inglewood. I had to go to Inglewood because I knew that was a black city and they would get it. And from there, Inglewood didn't shut me down. I remember going to Inglewood city councils and thought I was going to have to go to city council meetings and engage with them and navigate it similarly that Jeffrey did in Oakland, but I didn't have to. I just existed. I opened my doors, and Inglewood City Council would not let Inglewood PD come and shut me down. I remember when one of who's now a city councilman in Los Angeles, but I forget his name. He was a city councilman in Inglewood, and my company was called Inglewood IMCC. Of course, I didn't put medical cannabis in it, but it said IMCC Wellness Center. And so the city councilman came across, and he knocked on the door. We were scared, and he said, "What does it stand for?" And he said, "I thought so." I said, "Inglewood Medical Cannabis Club." And he said, "I thought so." He gave me my card back, and he moved on. And from then on, Inglewood PD did not shut me down because there was someone in Los Angeles trying to do medical cannabis before me, and her name was Sister Samaya. Oh, yeah. They arrested that girl so many times. They put her, for a little plant, they locked her up. So Sister Samaya, I don't forget you. I know you're a big part of Los Angeles. And so in Inglewood, going along my merry little way, I would always have to go up to Oakland to get cannabis and bring it back. And so there was challenges back and forth. Of course, I got stopped many times. But I remember getting a phone call from ASA, and I didn't know what that meant. And it was American for Safe Access. It was from a woman. And I remember meeting her, and she came down to Inglewood, and she just had a little car. It was just her. I just expected this big organization, this big mantra, to come down and make this presentation, and it wasn't. It was one person with a single justified mission, and it was Steph. And so Steph, from this day, 20 plus years later, I really appreciate you for coming down to Inglewood. And Don, I remember you. Thank you for always being inspirational for me. And so, obviously Black folks have always been disproportionately affected by the drug laws. We didn't feel the power to change them. In some sense, I believe actually we thought they were right. In some sense, I actually thought we Black people thought that getting arrested for marijuana or it being a crime was okay. And now, years later, because it's a natural plant. It was always something natural that Black folks are gonna gravitate towards. We would rather gravitate towards a plant than a pill. But that didn't exist back then. And the work that this organization has done collectively has changed things. We didn't see where we are now. We have work to do, but things have changed a lot because of ASA and because of you, Steph. And we as Black people have benefited from that. And so from this Black man to all Black people, thank you, Steph, for what you've done.
Kiva, mute us.
Your music out.
Thank you, Paul. I mean, I really can't speak right now. Actually, I mean, I think that without your face, without your presence, the other thing that you didn't mention was all of the work that you had done in the HIV/AIDS movement, and the knowledge that you brought from that movement to medical cannabis as well. That
well, Steph, I was a nurse, so I was a nurse during the AIDS days, and I got out of it. I remember AIDS wards. I remember there was a hospitals, just beds, rows of gay men dying of AIDS, and I remember as a nurse, at 4 or 5 o'clock, the lovers would get off of work. And West Hollywood, the lovers would get off work and get in the beds with them and close the curtains and take care of their lovers. We were dying of AIDS regularly. And we couldn't smoke a joint. And Dennis Peron's lover died of AIDS. And it began with that really crucial part. We were dying. Enough's enough.
I think, we learned, I personally learned so much from the HIV/AIDS movement, and really brought a lot of those lessons in, some of the simple, even words that you use, how important those are. Instead of saying an AIDS patient, a person's only a patient when a doctor's in the room, that they're people living with AIDS. Living with HIV, that's a big difference. And those words matter. Exactly. Those words matter. And I think something that, that's happened to the medical cannabis community is that people think of us, they call us medical cannabis patients. And sometimes we call ourselves medical cannabis patients. But what that's meant for a lot of people is that they just think about us when they need someone to come testify at a public hearing. Or to show up at for a news, a little news op. And then as soon as that's over and they have their license, then patients aren't still a part of that. And I think that what really made us able to create a movement, a nationwide movement for medical cannabis, for people who are in, Iowa and Indiana, people who would probably never see medical cannabis, was it's your bravery, Paul, and your.
It was desperation. It wasn't to make money.
Sometimes that can be a fine line.
We were desperate. Either give us a joint or we're gonna continue to die on a regular basis. The early HIV medications were horrible. They were intolerable. They were experimental cancer drugs that they had on the shelf some goddamn where. They said, let's give them to them people. Maybe that'll help them alive. And they were as worse as the disease. And so to not be able to have a joint was enough. And, on the backs of, my LGBT, my gay brothers who were dying daily, this movement sits.
Well, Paul, I'm so honored that you joined us today. I've missed you. It makes me really sad that we're not doing this conference in person. But thank you so much for all that you've done. And let's part of this 20-year, celebrating 20 years. One is that's a big number. Reminding what a cocky 25-year-old I was when I started Americans for Safe Access. To be honest, I thought it was going to take 2 years. But what I've sort of learned in this last year of reflecting and really looking back at our history and what we've done, and I look at sort of what are some of the inadequacies of the movement today. And I think that on one hand, a lot of people think we've already won. They don't understand that the dispensaries that you see today, that we were doing that as triage. That was a temporary solution to get patients off the battlefield of the war on drugs while we changed federal law. And now people look at the dispensary system and they're like, oh, you guys have won. And I always tell people, unless I change the name of this organization to Privileged Americans for Safe Access, we still got a long way to go. And I'm hoping that by retelling these stories, and of course, everyone here at the conference, and we'll make these videos, available to everyone, that it not only inspires other people, but re-inspires us, to recommit to this fight and to finish the work. And I think,
Steph, the work that you've done really helps Black folk. You know, I don't think we thought that we could be powerful in this space, and it would take a powerful, unassuming girl like yourself to get, and get in those people's faces and make a difference, and you have. And the disproportionate arrest for marijuana was obviously on us. And we did, as a people, as a Black race, didn't think to have a movement to change marijuana. We believed what they told us. That was wrong. There's a drug.
And I think a lot of people still believe that what they're doing is wrong. You know, there's those people in Indiana or in Iowa right now that are having to ask their kids to help them find marijuana so they can get through chemotherapy. They feel that same shame. And I was just writing something for someone the other day, and I realized that, part of our challenge for today is that people aren't taking responsibility for their privilege. And what I mean by that is the only reason I could do what I did at Americans for Safe Access. I'm a medical cannabis patient who is tenacious and honestly stubborn as hell. And when I was told that I couldn't have medical cannabis, I was mad, but I also knew because of my privilege, I could go continue to buy cannabis from brown and Black people and not get arrested. And those people would probably get arrested, but I would be safe. I could have not started Americans for Safe Access and been able to find cannabis for myself, right? And treat my illness with it. But I was very touched by the people who were putting their life on the line for people who weren't as privileged as me. And so, I'm a white girl that doesn't have kids. And, that put me in a position that it was safe for me to go on television and talk about my medical cannabis use and tell everybody, hey, I'm breaking federal law 5 times a day. And I knew that many people didn't have that privilege. And the same is true today. I feel like a lot of people, they pass their medical cannabis law, they get their going to that program, and they're not thinking about those patients in Iowa, or those African-American patients in Mississippi who are still fighting. And even when we pass medical cannabis laws, the only people that can afford it are also a part of a privileged community. So until we remove the federal barriers for medical cannabis and create programs with insurance coverage, and doctors are in a place where they are recommending or eventually prescribing cannabis as a frontline medication, right? Then we're still talking about a very, and maybe a little, not quite as privileged anymore, but still a pretty privileged class of people that have safe access to medical cannabis. And so,
well, the universe does what it does. If it takes a collective like this, America for Safe Access, Stephen, you have to play your part in what you're supposed to do with it. No one else could have done what you have done, Steph, because nobody else was set with that agenda. Nobody else was set with that mission from the universe. And the universe set you with that, and you did it. And let's do more, because you got to do what you got to do. And that's only inbred in you. I didn't want to go to DC and do that. I just wanted to go to the hood and change things in the hood.
Well, it truly takes a village. A big part of expanding rights in the states meant that it oftentimes, we didn't have the bandwidth to pass legislation to protect patients. And so part of our strategic plan meant that we had to utilize the courts. And so I'm so excited that Tony Bowles is with us today to tell us about his experience and his bravery in taking on one of the biggest arms of law enforcement in California. And through his bravery, we were able to secure rights for patients, not just in California, but the impact of the lawsuit that we did with Tony really made sure that every state included police protection. So Tony, welcome. I'm so excited that you're going to share your story with our members.
Thank you, Steph, and thank you all. I'm so happy to be here and to share my story. I'm Tony Bowles. I have been a patient advocate for a long time and a member of Americans for Safe Access. I am currently the chapter chair of the Bay Area chapter of Americans for Safe Access. So I moved here in 2002 following my mother, who immediately got her medical marijuana recommendation. And I was made her caregiver because she has mobility issues. So I was picking up cannabis for her. Coming back from one of those trips, I was pulled over by a California Highway Patrol officer for not having a license plate on the front of the car, which was not illegal in Florida. We had only been here 3 months. So he pulled me over for that. But upon that, he was able to smell cannabis, and he immediately asked me if I had it on me. I pulled out my caregiver certificate and showed it to him. He then continued to question me even more, asked me if I had cannabis on my possession. I did not know any better. When I got my caregiver certification, my mom got her recommendation, there wasn't instructions given to us how to handle law enforcement encounters. We knew how to go into the dispensary and obtain medicine, but that was about it. So I proceeded to then incriminate myself, tell the officer I had cannabis. He instructed me to get out of the car, put me in handcuffs, took the medicine, put me in the back of the police cruiser. I didn't understand what was going on. I kept saying I thought medical marijuana was the law. They just kept saying it's maximum enforcement. We have to look into this matter. So after about 15 minutes, they finally came back and said, we're going to let you go, but we're going to keep the medicine. We're going to also write you a citation. I was surprised and disappointed about this whole situation and kept thinking about what if it was my mother who had been pulled over. And the first people I could think of were Americans for Safe Access to contact. I had read about them in the news. They had been handling some court support for other medical marijuana cases. So I reached out to them. They said they were actually looking for plaintiffs to sue the California Highway Patrol because they were the worst violators of the state law. They were harassing patients the most. I said I would happily join this lawsuit to rectify the situation. Again, I couldn't believe this had happened. So I was instructed by Americans for Safe Access. They actually provided legal advice the whole way. They provided a legal advisor to come into court with me. And I learned a lot from this whole experience. I learned how not to further incriminate myself and how to train others, how to handle these law enforcement encounter situations. And from that, I was able to take all my expertise and share it with others and join the chapter and get involved in many different legal battles and legislative efforts to this day that I am involved in. Helping expand safe access across the board is something I'm very passionate about. So thank you all for being here, and thank you, Steph, and all the ASA staff from throughout the years that helped plant the seed and spread it throughout the country. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Tony. And I remember this very well. We were in the middle of doing a report that was called Out of Compliance, where we asked patients from around California to contact us if they've had a law enforcement in the last encounter in the last 6 months. And actually we got 300 people. We put together 300 people, and of those 300, 125 of those encounters were California Highway Patrol. And yeah, and really,
I know that.
Yeah, it was huge. It's so what I'd been calling the governor and the attorney general at the time saying, hey, all these people are still getting arrested. And they're like, thanks for letting us know. And so we put out this report, Out of Compliance, documenting all these cases, and took it to the governor and to the attorney general. And they said, they just blew it off. And so we knew we had to do something more aggressive. So we decided, California Highway Patrol was the most represented. And we asked a lot of those 125 people if they could join the lawsuit. And I think we ended up with 5 plaintiffs because it's scary. It's scary to take on the California Highway Patrol. And so I just want to thank you so much for your bravery. And also, I think that experience is clear, radicalized you, and you have been such an amazing advocate for patients in the Bay Area, and been with us shoulder to shoulder for the last 20 years. So thank you so
Thank
much.
you. I like to say that I actually fought the law and won because of ASA. I mean, yeah, it's amazing, an amazing experience. Thank you.
That's fantastic. Well, I know our participants are going to have lots of questions for you, and so we are going to jump into a Q&A. That was amazing. It was definitely a walk down memory lane. I'm getting some text here from folks, so sorry if I'm like going back and forth. But yeah, that was amazing. And I'm glad to have you guys all here together. Debbie, while we're waiting for everybody to get here, do you want to go through some of the Q&A that we have, or some questions we've gotten from our panelists?
Yeah, we already have a few questions, but please keep them coming if you have more. One of the first questions is, does ASA offer constituent skills workshops to share tips and strategies for communicating effectively with legislators?
Yes, we do. So one of the things that actually Caren helped us create is the ABCs of lobbying. And we have an advocacy center on our website where you can actually pick up a lot of different skills, not just lobbying skills, but also how to talk to the media, how to do interviews, how to talk to the press, all of these items. Sorry, there's a little technical.
No, you're fine. You're fine.
Okay. Making sure I'm not messing things up. Okay, there we go.
Oh,
now everyone's here. Great. And so because of how we had to put together the conference, we had some folks that had time to record ahead of time, and a few people over the last few days were able to make it. And so I'm going to actually start with questions for Rebecca Saltzman, who is actually Americans for Safe Access. Well, you had many titles with us. I think we brought you on as the organizer, lead organizer, and then you became our chief of staff. And so I'm just going to give you a couple minutes to talk a little bit about your first days with ASA. It's so good to see you. And your hair is longer than mine. Oh my God.
It's great to see all of you. It brings me back, like 8 years. So
our computers.
Oh,
Yeah.
we need to unmute our computer so I can actually hear you.
okay.
Sorry.
I was just saying that
Okay.
great to see all of you. It's like a reunion. ASA is still family to me. You know, I started volunteering with ASA when I was in college, and then it was one of my first jobs out of school, and it's where I learned to do everything I know how to do now. You know, and I loved hearing the panel, and especially some of what Steph and Caren said about how ASA was one of the only women-led organizations in this space at the time. And that was so powerful to me, having so many incredible women mentors that, you know, were really willing to do whatever it took to make sure that people throughout the country had safe access to cannabis. And I know that struggle still continues, but what has happened in the years I was there, the 5 years I was there, and then beyond has just been really incredible and inspiring. So how I got engaged, I mentioned, was as a student. I was one of the co-founders and co-leaders of the UC Berkeley chapter of Students for Sensible Drug Policy. And being in Berkeley, of course, one of the biggest, most local issues was medical cannabis. I actually remember the first time going into a dispensary. Duncan invited me to come speak at Berkeley Patients Group, and it was just amazing to see kind of how well organized it was, how people were really getting the services they needed, and it inspired me to want to do more. And then with ASA starting and there being so many opportunities to get involved with so many local actions and so many opportunities to write to our decision makers, it was great getting all the students engaged in that. And I very much remember probably one of the biggest things I helped organize when I was in college was there were a series of demonstrations around the country, and one was in Sacramento. And I helped get a busload of about 50 students from UC Berkeley to go up there to this demonstration with hundreds of people really speaking out against the federal reaction to medical cannabis in California. And it was the first time I was arrested for civil disobedience. And it was just so powerful having all those people be there, all of those people willing to, you know, sit there and get arrested, but knowing we would get out quickly, but kind of honoring what the other folks were doing, which was sitting in prison for 10 years or more, or, you know, as Dawn spoke about, worrying that the pizza guy with the wrong address was the DEA coming knocking on his door. So that inspired me even more. And so I was so excited to come work for ASA after college, you know, being a field organizer and then later being chief of staff, and working with all of you wonderful folks to, you know, bring safe access throughout the country. So it was a fabulous experience. I love what all of you continue to do, and you all inspire me.
It's so good to see you, Rebecca. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, it's great to hear everyone from this panel, but just the intensity of the work, you know, it's really hard to describe to people that, like, there was no clocking out at Americans for safe access. You know, we were constantly on with the raid preparedness. You know, if there was a raid happening, no matter what time, you know, we had signs in our cars and everybody just had to go. And, you know, you were just on all the time, you know, from trying to get people out of jail. I mean, it was just constant. And, you know, you really kept us organized, Rebecca. It was a lot of herding, not just cats, but like really frightened cats. So that was a lot to do. And we're appreciative of everything that you contributed to this work. And this makes me so sad that we're not all in person right now. But you know, one of the questions that we got was actually it was a question about sort of the history of CJS. And you know, Caren, I was just telling this story the other day because I don't think a lot of people know about Senator Mikulski and how big of a role she played in actually passing CJS. And I don't know if you remember this meeting when we first opened the office in DC in 2006, when you and I went to meet with her. And she told us she needed 3 things from us before she could help. And she told us we had to get labor involved. She told us we had to get herbal medicine movement involved. And we had to pass a law in Maryland. And the first 2 actually came pretty easy. We got UFCW involved, and then Teamsters came after. Then we got the American Herbal Products Association involved and the American Herbal Pharmacopoeia. And then in Maryland, we kept having this struggle with passing the state law until actually, I don't know if you remember this, but the drug policy groups, they moved aside this one year to work on decrim, and it actually made it super easy for us to pass the medical cannabis bill because it kind of cleared up the conversation. And then the next day we got a call from Mikulski's office, and she said, "How can I help?" And she just happened to be in the perfect place on the appropriations chair to pull across the bill that we'd passed in Congress. So that was, you know, talk about long-term strategies, right? That was 2006. She asked us to do that, and we passed it in 2015. So that was a long ride. And thanks, Caren, for all your work in doing that.
Oh, my pleasure. I think there's 2 points to make. One, it underscores Tony's transnational, I guess, engagement, because he was also engaged in the Maryland effort. But I also think the Maryland effort for ASA underscored, and there's a question here in the chat about home grow rights and the importance of home grow rights in states. And I think for us, Maryland became a key issue where that, like, defending that right became part and parcel to where ASA stood from that point forward, in terms of having patients being able to exit the market and access their own safe and legal and more affordable supply. So I think that remains true today, but it also remains true that policy making in the cannabis space, in any space, as Rebecca can offer, is small movements, and continuing to stick with it. And if nothing else, ASA has definitely been a crash course for all of us about what sticking to the movement means, and the type of success that you can have over 20 years.
Absolutely. So I'm wondering, I just kind of want to open up the panel. If you guys have questions for each other, or just want to keep bantering, and Debbie's going to bring in give a question for us, Debbie.
Say there are a few questions in the chat if you guys haven't.
Because I just want to hang out.
And I do want to say that we are very supportive of home grow rights. People always ask us that question, and of course we are, anything that helps patients. So yes, we are very supportive of homegrown.
And I think, for people who have some questions about home grow, and I think that this is important for people to understand, is that, we often hear the people that are coming out against home grow are homeowners associations, but also the cannabis market. And, what we always tell people is, anyone can grow tomatoes. But most people don't. Most people go and get tomatoes from the store. And even for people who do grow tomatoes at home, they usually have to buy some tomatoes at the store as well, to supplement. So having people cultivate their own medicine isn't going to hurt your bottom line for sure. But I think we have to remember that up to this point,
Steph?
sorry, I got kicked off. The universe didn't like my point. But up to this point, the cannabis marketplace, hasn't stepped up to the level of creating standardized products for all of us. So for many people, we have to cultivate the medicine that we need, because we may not be able to find it in the marketplace. So I think that people need to be a lot more open to that concept, and know, again, it's not going to hurt anyone's bottom line. There are lots of ways that people can cultivate without offending their neighbors, which we actually, on our website, we have some cultivation tips, but those include how to be a good neighbor while cultivating, which is important. Other questions, Debbie? There's no question.
So, Paul, did you have something to say?
Yeah, I did actually.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Just in listening to this conference, which is very informative, just in listening to how, I don't want to say this, but how you all are able to summarize this message. I was listening to Caren and how she talks about access points and how you're able to make the language comfortable. Could you even imagine any brother like myself looking like me going into the rooms that you all were able to successfully go into and speak the language, how you've been able to speak it, so that they don't have to be afraid of it? So it's been a re-education for me in these past 30, 40 hours or so, listening to you, Caren, and you, Steph, and you, Rebecca, and how you all were able to shape the message so that it wasn't threatening. Because you women can do a lot more than we men can do. They really can, and this is evident of it.
Yes.
This is evident of it. You all are pretty unassuming initially, but then you make shit change. Well, I congratulate you for doing that. I wouldn't have ever thought to take this fight to the national level. I don't think any males would have been able to do it as successfully and as succinctly as you have been able to do it, Steph, and your staff.
Thank you, Paul.
Only you guys could have done what you did.
Well, thank you so much, Paul. But I also want to say, you know, this is also a good lesson in coalition building, because if you know, we are really looking, you know, we see ourselves as fighting for, you know, safe access for everyone. And if you hadn't you know, talked to us, hadn't been in constant contact, then, you know, we wouldn't have been able to shape policies that were actually effective and work for everyone. So I think it's, I mean, I totally agree with you on the woman part. But as far as being able to, you know, make sure that the laws that we're passing actually served everyone, you know, that's where coalition work is really important. And the fact that you weren't like, okay, crazy girl, take your car and go away, but really engaged and really, you know, stepped up and helped us shape that policy. We were able to, you know, make sure that we were creating a, you know, an umbrella that served everyone and wasn't just, you know, helping the privileged. And I think,
Well,
you know,
to this day,
I got to
Stephanie,
say that word a
no
lot.
idea how I got wrapped into this marijuana world. I have no idea. From meeting Dennis Perone, from Terrence Hallahan, who was the district attorney of San Francisco,
Parents, yeah.
from him assistant taking me to Dennis Perone's farm, to Jeff Jones, and I have no idea how you all sort of corralled me into this space. But you picked me, and I did what I needed to do, and the rest is history.
Can I expand on what Paul was saying there? Hi, Paul. This is Tony. I don't think I ever got to meet you in the past, but I love hearing all about your story, and it's very nice to meet you. So I just wanted to expand on my summary and say how amazing of a journey this really was, how magical. When I said in my story that I heard about Asa through a news story, I was true, absolutely, but that led me down to the trial of Ed Rosenthal, and I witnessed a spectacle like I had never seen before. Giant puppets and people on bullhorns, and Robin Few, Stacy Schwinn, Sarah Schrader, Hillary McClay, all the people who are not here, all the women who helped with that and then guide me further along the way. Caren giving me my first citizen lobby training, and then being able to utilize that in DC and in Maryland, and coming back to what I'm doing now to this day. Still being involved. It's just really great to be a part of this, and thank all of you. And I can't leave out one of the most important men, Don, who has definitely been a mentor in my life as well. Thank you. It's so good to see you, Don.
Hi, Tony.
Hi. Thank you all.
So I'm wondering, as we're, you know, a question for everyone here, which is, I'm sure, you know, over the last few years, when talking to me, you've heard me just talk about my frustration about how, and I think I mentioned it a little bit in the panel about how so many people have, you know, think that we've won. And I think part of that is that, you know, with the DEA knocking on the doors and coming in, like we were able to put a spotlight on that for the media, for the public to see. And people saw, you know, these acts of violence, and they're like, that's definitely not what I want my drug laws to do. But the suffering that's happening today, that
Oops, she's back.
We lost her again.
There she is.
sorry, there's like there's in this office building, there's like 1 million people jumping on our Wi-Fi, so I apologize. But I'm, you know, I think that, you know, the crisis is something we can't really, you know, bring to the news, like the you know, the mother who can't go see her daughter get married because she can't travel with her cannabis, or the you know, the father that can't go to their kids' graduation because they can't travel for cannabis, or you know, the patients who, you know, just really can't afford to even consider medical cannabis. And I'm wondering, as you guys have been sort of looking at where we are today, just what your thoughts are on bringing medical cannabis, to continue this fight, like how to reinvigorate people on the medical cannabis fight.
Well, I think it's
Steph-
going to be a challenge. I mean, I've heard people talking about homegrown. There's still some, I guess, adjustment to do because, back in the day, cannabis had such a huge profit margin because it was illegal. Now the profit margin, I'm thinking, is probably a little less. So, the companies that thought they were going to make a gazillion dollars, they're going to resist. You're growing it in your condo in the garage. They're going to resist a lot of forward movement because now maybe there's some entrenchment. But it's going to continue to grow, no pun intended, and we'll see where it goes because the price of cannabis has gone down a lot where it should have been, but it's probably going to go down even more. And then, so people who have hooked their hung line and sweet sinker into it are going to probably try to control it like the tobacco industry did. And so there's still some work that's going to come out in the wash. We'll see.
Rebecca, what do you think? I know you're probably not in, as most of the people that are on this panel, into the day today anymore about cannabis, but where does it look like we are in this journey, and what is your sort of advice as far as us keeping that base going and keeping people invigorated?
Yeah, it's interesting because I, continue to talk to people about this as it kind of comes up. And the first reaction is always like, isn't that done? There were problems for a while, there were raids, here in the Bay Area, people just don't hear about it anymore. Marijuana is legal for adult use. It's kind of like, well, we've checked that box, let's move on to the next issue. So I think it's just important for the people, still involved, and kind of the people used to be involved more, like people like me, to continue to educate folks about it. A few years ago, I asked the Alameda County Democratic Party to take a position on a bill in the California State Legislature around employment rights for medical cannabis patients. And I think almost everybody was like, you mean there aren't employment rights? And of course, now there finally are. But I mean, we started working on that when I was at ASA. So it took a really, really long time. Right. But it was sort of an opportunity for people to realize that this isn't done, that there's still things to fight. So I think it's important to keep raising these issues, finding out whether it's through legislation, whether it's through media stories, whether it's through one-on-one conversations, to just continue to remind folks that it's not done, that there's still issues. I mean, I think, Steph, what you brought up before, until we can get health insurance to cover it, we're not there. We haven't won the battle. So just continuing to educate folks, and you're all doing a great job of that.
No, I think we said, Rebecca, is also something that we found that I think is a good reminder, which is, I think that we often assume that people were our allies, that they're all caught up on medical cannabis. And so, the Alameda Democratic Committee, you would think at least those people would have some idea what's going on. But that's a nice reminder that actually, the fact that people think we have won means that they don't think we still need help. And so it means the old school organizing, which means bringing those issues up to your, whatever party you're part of, other organizations, writing those letters to the editor, or sending those responses on Twitter to news stories to be like, actually, you forgot about this part. So Caren, what do you think?
I mean, I think this is a question that's a sort of a looking back and being aware, and maybe and being careful about what you wish for, right? Like, I mean, part of the patchwork of state laws that we have is born out of the success we've had in so many of these states. But I remember a time when we were told by other organizations in the early days that as soon as 26 states hit, we would have national legalization, that it would just be a flip of a switch and we would just have it. And here we are, 11 states to go. And it literally has taken, actions by this Congress to support research, which is also an endeavor ASA supported 20 years ago in the early days. But also, President Biden's action to get us, one step closer to an HHS review of cannabis's medical value. And those are two important, movements forward that I think reflect a need to address the patchwork, that the patchwork is not coverage, it's not safe, it's not affordable, it's not navigable. And that those things matter. And that is why there's a continued effort to bring about federal change as the ticket to our happy reality.
Fantastic. Don, how about you? I know that you're still ears deep in all this, but knowing that we've got people here from all over the country, what perspective can you bring to this as far as like us, pushing through?
Well, there was definitely a change in the conversation that happened in 2016 when we adopted adult use legalization in California. And a lot of folks did adopt that mentality of like, oh, we're done with this work. We finally polished it off. And so when I talk to people now and they tell me that, I always have to remind them that Proposition 64 here in California did not cure cancer. It didn't cure AIDS. It didn't cure chronic pain. Like, we're still dealing with all those things. They just don't need the doctor's recommendation anymore. And that's one of the big changes we've seen, is that that there was sort of an industry that grew up around writing doctor's recommendations, and people don't have to go through that treadmill anymore to get access to the dispensaries. But that doesn't mean things are over, because there are medications and dosages that are not available for the adult use consumers. And we also have a huge civil rights problem. I think this is something we're going to see in states nationwide, is that when it comes to employment, housing, parental custody, and access to healthcare, there's still huge problems. And Steph, I know you remember in California that an ASA member died because he was denied an organ transplant when he tested positive for medical cannabis. And it took us 2 years in the state legislature to rally enough support to change that law in California. And so we're going to see that, I think, all over the state. And I have the opportunity right now to work in Illinois, New Jersey, and now in New York. And I'm definitely seeing a belief in people that if you just legalize it and license businesses, the work is done. And it's so not true. I will tell you that after we passed Proposition 215 way back in the dark ages, I and everyone else thought we were done with cannabis. Like, it was finished, it was handled, like that was settled. And 2 years later, the DEA was running all over the state, busting people. And so I don't think that's going to happen again, but it could. And that's why we have to change federal law.
That's true.
And I will say, finally, in terms of federal law, everyone says, oh, it's going to happen. It's inevitable. It's definitely going to happen. And they're right. It will definitely happen. The question is, how will it happen? That's the thing that I think we have to be really aware of right now and conscientious. The law changed here in California. We did. We changed the law. We legalized cannabis, but only kind of. Not all cannabis, not for all people. And there are taxes and onerous regulations. And so, yes, it's legal, but it's not legal like we thought it would be legal. And so that's the thing people have to remember, is like, if we're going to change federal law, patients need to be at the table talking to lawmakers about what that looks like, because we don't want corporate federal legalization. We don't want tax-driven federal legalization. We want patient-driven federal legalization.
Well, I think we have just one more minute before we have to move on to the next portion of the conference. Are there any final thoughts that people would like to give?
Yes, real
Go ahead,
quick.
Tony.
So I just wanted to say, I think I have a unique perspective as a grassroots organizer and somebody who speaks to patients on a daily basis, hearing all the complications that patients have. And we've had a pretty successful year this year. We passed employment rights. making sure patients who are using pain meds are able to use without being having their treatment canceled by doctors. But it was a long road. 5 years I took over this chapter right after Alma was passed, and it was really hard getting energy. I think one of the things was SB 34, the compassion bill passing and compassion groups forming and building alliances with those groups and starting to see more energy around patient concerns in the state again. And I speak exclusively to here in Northern California in the resurgence of advocacy around this issue. So I'm happy to see a lot more advocates joining our chapter meetings, which are still happening every first Tuesday of the month. We usually play one of the videos from the grassroots advocacy ASA provides. So please check it out. Check us out in our meetings, please. Join us. That's it.
Good plug, Tony.
Thank you.
No, thank you, Tony. And thanks everyone for your continued advocacy. I'm so sad that we're not going to all go hang out at the bar right now. But this is a nice reminder to stay in touch. And a couple people were asking if if we were going to have a social event. Actually, on Wednesday, we'll be sending out a link, but we'll have a social channel where people can get on and chat a little bit more. Everyone that is on this panel, you have had huge impact on me personally, on shaping the trajectory of Americans for Safe Access and to millions of patients nationwide. So thank you all so much for joining me. And
Don, it was good to see you again, brother.
Much love.
Bye-bye, everyone.
thank you.
On behalf of Americans for Safe Act staff, the board, and all of our members, we want to say a very special thank you to our Unity sponsors for the 2022 Unity Conference. This is our 10th annual conference, and I know many of these sponsors have been with us for the last 10 years. So I want to say a very special thank you to Dr. Bonners, to Metric, to 3C Cannabis Consulting, to Canopy Growth, Tacoma Wellness, the American Herbal Products Association, Cannabis for Cancer Declaration, Cannabis MD, Columbia Care, Council for Federal Cannabis Regulations, Healer, the National Pain Relief, Supply Chain OpEx Consulting, the University of Maryland School of Pharmacy, UKTI Collective, and Evoke. Again, thank you so much. This has been a great conference, and we couldn't have done it without you all.